Hey classies, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for History 17B, Chapter 28, Post-War Prosperity and Cold War Fears, 1945 to 1960. Next slide. This is an overview of the chapter. First heading is entitled The Challenges of Peacetime. At the end of World War II, U.S. servicemen and women returned to civilian life, and all hoped the prosperity of the war years would continue. Next slide. The GI Bill eased many veterans' return by providing them with unemployment compensation, low-interest loans, and money to further their education. Next slide. However, African American, Mexican American, and gay veterans were often unable to take advantage of these benefits fully or at all. Next slide. Meanwhile, Japanese Americans faced an uphill struggle in their attempts to return to normalcy. Next slide. Many women who had made significant professional gains in wartime found themselves dismissed from their positions. Next slide. President Harry Truman attempted to extend Roosevelt's New Deal with his own Fair Deal, which had the goal of improving wages, housing, and health care and protecting the rights of African Americans. Next slide. Confronted by a Congress dominated by Republicans and Southern Democrats, however, Truman was able to achieve only some of his goals. Next slide. The next heading is entitled The Cold War. Joy at the ending of World War II was quickly replaced by fears of conflict with the Soviet Union. Next slide. The Cold War heated up as both the United States and the Soviet Union struggled for world dominance. Next slide. Fearing Soviet expansion, the United States committed itself to assisting countries whose governments faced overthrow by communist forces and gave billions of dollars to war-torn Europe to help rebuild. And here's a political cartoon about the Marshall Plan. Next slide. While the United States was achieving victory in its thwarting of Soviet attempts to cut Berlin off from the West, the nation was less successful in its attempts to prevent communist expansion in Korea. Next slide. The development of atomic weapons by the Soviet Union and the arrest of Soviet spies in the United States and Britain roused fears in the United States that communist agents were seeking to destroy the nation from within. Next slide. Loyalty Board investigations and hearings before House and Senate committees attempted to root out Soviet sympathizers in the federal government and in other sectors of American society, including Hollywood and the military. Next slide. The next heading is entitled The American Dream. In 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower became President of the United States. Fiscally conservative but ideologically moderate, he sought to balance the budget while building a strong system of national defense. Next slide. This defense policy led to greater emphasis on the possible use of nuclear weapons in any confrontation with the Soviet Union. Next slide. Committed to maintaining peace, however, Eisenhower avoided engaging the United States in foreign conflicts during his presidency, and the economy boomed. Young Americans married in record numbers, moved to the growing suburbs, and gave birth to the largest generation to date in U.S. history. Next slide. As middle-class adults, they conform to the requirements of corporate jobs and suburban life, while their privileged children enjoyed a consumer culture tailored to their desires. Next slide. The next heading is entitled Popular Culture and Mass Media. Young Americans in the post-war period had more disposable income and enjoyed greater material comfort than their forebears. Next slide. These factors allowed them to devote more time and money to leisure activities and the consumption of popular culture. Next slide. Rock and roll, which drew from African American roots in the blues, embraced themes popular among teenagers, such as young love and rebellion against authority. There's good old Elvis Presley. Next slide. At the same time, traditional forms of entertainment, such as motion pictures, came under increasing competition from a relatively new technology, that is, television. Next slide. The next heading is entitled The African American Struggle for Civil Rights. After World War II, African American efforts to secure greater civil rights increased across the United States. African American lawyers such as Thurgood Marshall, who later became the first African American Supreme Court justice, championed cases intended to destroy the Jim Crow system of segregation that had dominated the American South since Reconstruction. Here's Thurgood Marshall. Next slide. The landmark Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education prohibited segregation in public schools. This was in 1954, by the way. Next slide. In Montgomery, Alabama, it was the grassroots efforts of African American citizens who boycotted the city's bus system that brought about change. Next slide. Throughout the region, many white Southerners made their opposition to these efforts known. Too often, this opposition manifested itself in violence and tragedy, as in the murder of Emmett Till. Next slide. And that's it for chapter 28.